For the majority of human history, humans have sustained thriving lifeways living in symbiosis with the earth. Regardless of where we come from, we all stem from land-based hunter-gatherers who intimately know their place within ecology. Today, we find ourselves living within a disconnected society that has strayed far from its wild roots. This disconnection has resulted in detrimental impacts for the earth and all who call this place home. Join us as we take a deep dive into our wild origins and how we can actively rewild and make decisions that lead to a regenerative and connected future. We pay our deepest respects to the Aboriginal culture, law and spirituality of this land. May we continue to learn from the wisdom of the past so that we can create a future of thriving land-based culture. I'm your host, Eva Ann Goffra. Thanks for joining us today on the Wild Beings podcast. Cool. Thanks for being here, everybody. Today, our guest is Peter Michael Bauer. So Peter Michael Bauer is an anthropologist, an experimental archeologist, historian, and lifelong community organiser. His work focuses on the social and environmental impacts of the Neolithic revolution and how understanding these impacts can provide us with solutions to the sixth mass extinction. Since the early 2000s, Peter has been an integral catalyst in the human rewilding movement. This movement works to create resilience through the return to place-based regenerative subsistence strategies, inspired by those that exist outside of and those that existed prior to the formation of agrarian states. Peter is an author, a rewilding and ancestral skills teacher, and the founder of Rewild Portland. Thanks for joining us today, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so back in 2020 was when I first really had a deep dive into your work, Peter, and I was living on my aunt's property in Belton, and I didn't really have a lens or a framework or language then for rewilding. And I remember finding your podcast and being like, wow, and then following your online work and ended up doing your Rewilding 101 online. I think it was a 4-week program.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I just remember feeling like, oh my goodness, like everything that I had been kind of leaning towards and feeling on an intuitive level, like trying to rewild my lens of how I saw humanity and their relationship with the land and even what we ate and how we related to each other. I feel like you covered that all within that. So that was a really exciting part of my kind of beginning journey into rewilding. So yeah, it's really exciting to be able to have you here on the Wild Beings podcast, all the way from Portland over in the US. And yeah, I would just love to start by asking you, I guess, the basic question of what your understanding of rewilding is.
Yeah. Well, I just also want to say it's been really cool to watch your school grow over the last few years and all the amazing things that you guys are doing out there too. So, and I almost came out last December, but things didn't end up happening, but maybe next year.
Oh, we look forward to that.
Yeah, I'll be out there at some point for sure.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. I came to rewilding through a magazine called Green Anarchy magazine that was edited by a famous anarchist here in the States, in Eugene, Oregon, which is just a couple hours south of Portland. And he was editing this magazine called Green Anarchy. And the third issue they called The Rewilding. And I don't even remember where I saw it. But at this point in my life, I had already this was years after dropping out of high school and running away from home to learn wilderness survival and learn about hunter-gatherers. Because essentially I read Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. And, in that book, he kind of proposes that the hunter-gatherer way of life is better or was better or much more well-suited and adapted to an ecological framework than agrarian civilization. And so at that time, I read it when I was 16, and I sort of had this the sense of urgency that civilization was going to collapse overnight just struck me. And so I just ran away from home, started going to wilderness schools, and reading anthropology voraciously, trying to figure out like what is the sustainable way to live, and can we understand that by studying hunter gatherers. And then when I read, randomly got this Green Anarchy magazine that had the word rewilding, I read it and I was like, wow, this is like, this word just describes what I've been doing this whole time, for the last few years. And it wasn't really a prevalent word at that time. I think it kind of emerged from the Earth First community, tree forest activism community in the 80s. And it was sort of two sides from the beginning. I think there was a conservation side because Earth First was based on direct action conservation. But because Earth First was direct action, it was also made up of a lot of like left leaning people. And so there were a lot of people in there that were also like, wow, we've been domesticated and need to rewild as well. And so there was sort of, two camps that kind of formed out of that. One of them was made by Dave Foreman, who wrote the book Rewilding the West, and eventually was sort of, he left Earth First or was kicked out, depending on who you talk to, I think, by the younger anarchist generation. I think he was maybe too conservative for their, whatever their views. But yeah, he went into this conservation side of things, and the anarchists like Jean Zerzin, in reading things like Ted Kaczynski's anti-technology manifesto and stuff like that, ended up kind of dreaming up this concept of anarcho-primitivism, which is essentially the idea that stateless societies or anarchist societies is the environment of human evolution. That's how our social organizations were organized for millions of years. And state hierarchies are relatively recent and have a close relationship to agrarian societies or agrarian subsistence, which is sedentary, as well as basically slaves. And the origin of slavery and things like that stems from these sedentary agrarian societies. And so when I read that book, I was like, or the magazine rather, I was like, oh, I finally have a word to just like describe what it is that I'm doing. And I think a lot of the times now when people hear the word rewilding, they don't understand the cultural, political origins of it. Which I think is something that I champion for every time I talk about it. Ever since I read that magazine back in 2004, we had a Rewild forum that was an international forum that lasted for a few years before Facebook kind of destroyed the online forums. And yeah, there was quite a bit of a movement in terms of this form of rewilding. And then at some point, I think, it was kind of snatched up by like social media entrepreneurs, and then it just became sort of more of like a twisted version of the paleo lifestyle or something like that. That was sort of more gleaning or leaning towards just like natural, whatever that means, right? There wasn't a lot of science, I think, going into it. Is more like preconceived notions of what natural and wildness are, and so I think, certain things came out of that, like, if people don't really deconstruct what wildness means, if they don't come from the political understanding that humans were collaborative egalitarians, you could take this sort of like traditional living or natural living and kind of extrapolate it more into like a social Darwinism form of it, where you lead to like hierarchy and fascism, or you think that those things are like normal and natural when they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I
Yeah.
feel like that's sort of my main edge with championing the term rewilding is trying to maintain the politicized aspect of it and maintain the integrity that humans evolved in equal societies. And so if you're going to do rewilding stuff, it should be focused on equality within communities and not hierarchy.
Yeah, for sure. That's very well said. So essentially, it's like um, the very beginning thought process of rewilding is understanding that we were not always this way. Because I feel like so many
Totally.
people in the modern world
Yes.
probably are so busy they don't
Yes.
even think about that. And that's been
Totally.
something that's been really interesting for me. It's like actually just providing that thought or that belief that actually, have you ever pondered on what we were like before now, because civilization is so big and grand, it kind of takes all of your focus. So that's really
Totally.
interesting, just getting people to start there.
Yeah, and I think when, people think when you say something like that too, they think now like today, and they think maybe you're talking about like 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. they don't understand what we're talking about is like 10,000 years ago, right? So humans haven't changed much, Homo sapiens in 200,000 years. Written history is only 5,000 years old, and the first written document is the Code of Hammurabi, and it's a catalog of slaves. If that tells you anything, about where the origins of writing and things like that. Um, and so, what anthropology has taught us, and paleoanthropology, is that for the majority of human history, we lived in relative harmony. That's not to say that violence never existed. That's an absurd thing to say, or that all societies were peaceful or whatever. I think those are absurdities. But the evidence shows that there wasn't things like warfare. There wasn't colonization. That's not to say that there wasn't like murder. There's definitely signs of like individual on individual violence, but in terms of like large scale, like annihilation warfare, where you have like huge swaths of people killing lots of other people, that begins with the sedentary cultures that started farming. And this is the case across the world. Farming didn't just originate in the Fertile Crescent. There's lots of different societies all around the world, on every continent, where humans were living in the last 10,000 years, who started this, and we see these same patterns develop every time.
Absolutely. And that's something to think about in itself as well, that the concept of war is actually not a normal thing, and it is quite
Totally.
a recent thing because of these particular sedentary ways of living. And that's another huge thing that I think is really important for the modern mind to grasp, that actually, even though it's on the news and on the TV and everything all the time, it's not a normal thing. It's not a
Right.
normal thing, and let's
Yeah.
ask why it's actually happening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
so I want to kind of go back a little bit, and I want to, because a lot of people might be wondering what certain words are and things like that. And I want
Mm.
you to just chat a little bit about the Neolithic Revolution and really what essentially that is. And yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so Neolithic means new stone, and it's a reference to the Stone Age. In their Stone Age is divided into multiple categories, but you have the Upper Paleolithic, Lower Paleolithic, Neolithic, um, and they just kind of differentiate time frames. And so, like Upper Paleolithic is more recent, Lower Paleolithic is like a really long time ago, and that started like the first stone tools for a really long time, for about 50 years or so. We thought that the very first stone tools that humans used were what's called the Oldowan industry, and it's a specific type of stone tool, assemblage. There's like, you have a core, which is the stone that you're striking to get a flake off of. And then you have a hammerstone that hits the core that creates the flake. So there's three stones there. You have the flake that comes off of the core and the hammerstone that is generating that flake. Sometimes the flakes are different shapes. So you can get one that's called a burin, which is more for like scoring things. It has like a fine, a three-sided point, like a pyramid or something, and it's long and thin. Then you have like flake knives and a couple of other random things like this make up what's called the Oldowan industry. Um, of course, now there's actually an older one that they found that predates even the Homo genus. That's 3.3 million years ago in Africa, which means it's part of our ancestors, the Australopiths, which is confusing because they decided to call us humans because of those stone tools that they found with Homo habilis, the first human. Anyway, this is a tangent to just get to what the Neolithic is. But part of the kind of explaining the sort of like absurdity or audacity, or I don't know, just what makes the Neolithic so weird, is all of this. The old one industry lasted for 1 million years. So humans were basically using the same level of technology for 1 million years. They didn't alter their tools much at all. Like there's no real signs of experimentation, even. We just sort of see the same stone tools. That's why we call it an industry. So then that started 2.5 million years ago. So then you have about 1.5 million years ago, after 1 million years of the old one industry, there's a new one that's called the Acheulean industry. And we see kind of like all over on the three continents at that time, because at that point, Homo erectus had migrated out of Africa and was living across the lowlands of Eurasia. And we see the Acheulean hand axe, or the Acheulean industry, which is like, again, the same type of tools that go on for a really long time, maybe another 1 million years or so. Um, And then you start to see more sophistication with like Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and Denisovans and things like that, where they're sort of differentiating and coming up with different tools. Um, and then this goes on for, the Upper Paleolithic. There was sort of a cultural explosion where humans, Homo sapiens specifically, migrated out of Africa across Eurasia, down into Australia, down into North and Central and South Americas. And you see like huge, huge amounts of diversification of technologies there. Um, so around 10,000 years ago, something changes, and what that changes is it's marked in the stone tools that we see people using. So when we call it the Neolithic Revolution, what we're talking about is a whole new set of technology that kind of exploded in multiple places around the world, not exactly simultaneously, but within several thousand years of each other. Um,
Yeah.
and a lot of that has to do with like specifically Neolithic tools are grindstones for grinding agricultural products. So we know that humans weren't really farming, or if they were eating things like wheat and stuff like that, they weren't doing it on a massive scale. They probably were, humans are opportunists, and they've done like isotope tests on Neanderthal teeth and things like this. And they found that like, yeah, 100,000, 150,000 years ago, humans were probably eating grains, but we weren't making it a massive staple of our diet because we weren't producing them, and we didn't have the technology to mass produce them. So like in order to really eat a lot of grain as a staple, you need like a mortar and pestle to grind it all down, right? And
Yeah.
so at the
Yeah.
Neolithic, we start to see mortar and pestles popping up all over in various communities that are now doing like farming as a normal full-time thing for their subsistence. So, when we talk about agriculture and the Neolithic Revolution, it wasn't exactly a revolution in the sense of like political revolution, although it was, if you consider, that a lot of these agrarian societies then started storing food, started domesticating animals, domesticating crops, becoming sedentary, and which led to what's called the Neolithic demographic transition in anthropology. And it basically just has to do with these, a massive amounts of health problems start to come up. Hierarchy and slavery becomes a normal part of these sedentary societies. Meanwhile, like hunter-gatherers are still living everywhere during the Neolithic Revolution. It's not like they went away. And oftentimes these civilizations would rise. These agrarian civilizations would rise and then collapse, and people would just like go back to hunting and gathering because that was more adaptable. And they might have had a population decline because oftentimes these agrarian societies like build up, artificially inflate the population of a land base that hunting and gathering doesn't support. And then
Yeah.
when their crops fail because of climate change or disease or whatever it is, oftentimes there's a slight or a massive population decline depending on how big these people are, population wise. And then this just goes on, until the Bronze Age or whatever, right? Like, so this is 5,000 years ago or so. People start. Some crazy things happened 5,000 years ago. So 5,000 years into the Neolithic Revolution or the Neolithic time period, whatever you want to call it, they people in these sedentary societies were susceptible to disease. And when you start to domesticate animals and you're sedentary, you basically live in filth because where are you going to put all of the, waste that comes out of yourself, the other people, and the animals? Like there was no toilets, there's no filtration systems. And so people are just basically going to, they're defecating and urinating and all this stuff like right where they live, along with all the animals. And you have these diseases that then cross the species barrier from the domesticated animals into humans and then kill all the humans, right? And so there's these massive populations rising and falling for like 5,000 years. And something happened around 5,000 years ago where basically the majority of the diseases had gone through the populations. And those Neolithic village sites explode in population, to the point where they're essentially colonizing and conquering neighboring societies at that point, because they have essentially 5,000 years of natural selection for disease immunity. And so they're basically like these, novel diseases that would never have transferred to humans without domestication have killed the humans for 5,000 years. And eventually something happens where the majority of those diseases have killed people. And now we see this like massive explosion of population. And they call that the Neolithic demographic transition. Um,
Wow.
Anyway, yeah, I could keep blabbing on. But I don't know if you want to ask another
No,
question or.
it's great, and it's really unique information as well because, yeah, like you said, even the word rewilding, like for a lot of people, I guess it's just about, yeah, getting back to the land, and that's a really great avenue of it. But it is also understanding this huge transition journey that we have had from hunter gatherer lifestyles to now where we're at today, and it
Totally.
is fascinating. And on that note, there was a podcast you did with Dr. Leonard Martin, like many,
Mm,
many years
mm-hmm.
ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that podcast so much.
Mm-hmm.
It was really deeply like, wow, it just was really, really insightful. And there was part of that podcast, he spoke about the transition from immediate return to delayed return and how that literally completely shifted human culture, human behavior, and human
Totally.
ways of thinking. And that's something that I think about a lot, like comparing the modern mind of the individual to Indigenous ways of thinking, which is much more of a pattern and a web. And do you just want to speak to maybe, yeah, what is immediate return and delayed return, and then how that changed everything?
Yeah. Yeah. So James Woodburn was an anthropologist working with multiple hunter gatherers around the world in the 60s and 70s. And he coined this term immediate return and delayed return to differentiate between the two sort of types of hunter gatherers that he observed that were different in major ways. Other people have, used the terms complex and simple. I prefer immediate return and delayed return because it actually gets to the material means that we're talking about, whereas simple and complex are words that could mean anything to anybody. But when we
Yeah.
say immediate return and delayed return, we know exactly what we're talking about. So immediate return societies are the societies that essentially hunt and gather for food and they don't store it. So day to day, they go out, they get their food, they bring it back to their base camp, they cook it, they eat it. This is in theory how humans evolved for however many years, since the million 2 million years or whatever, more than that, of human evolution is theorized, at least when we started having a fire, which, like, anthropologically it's agreed upon that about 700,000 years is like the oldest evidence of fire. But if we think about that, it's probably a lot older than that. And when we look at the physiological changes that happened between Homo habilis, the first human, and Homo erectus, a later human, it's pretty clear that there's some major shift happening. And so a lot of people theorize that Homo erectus was transformed in that way because of our usage of fire, not
And how long
just
ago
stone
was that?
tools. Homo erectus is about 1.5 million years ago. It correlates to the Acheulean hand axe that I was talking about. So I imagine that the Acheulean hand axe and Homo erectus, like, fire has probably been a part of human society for at least 1 million years in some way or another, and potentially more than that. But we don't know. We
Yeah.
just don't know. So, hard to say, but like that would be my guess from the things I've read and everything. But the agreed upon time period is like 400,000 to 700,000 is when we start to see like evidence of like hearths and what they call fire cracked rock. So humans that are, heating up rocks with fire and using for various purposes, cooking or heat
Yeah.
or, whatever. So immediate return is essentially what we call the social or the subsistence structure of our environment of evolutionary adaptation, which is like the central kind of core component to what I think of when I think of rewilding. Because people say, well, we live in a mismatch, right? We need to rewild because we're no longer wild. But what is that mismatch, and what did a wild existence actually look like? And this is why I say it's really important to get into the political side of this, right? Because if we look at our environment of evolutionary adaptation, then what are we best adapted for? Sometimes in like the paleo community, they'll use the word optimized. I feel like that lends itself towards like eugenics and things like that. So I try to say adapted, like what are we best adapted to, rather than like optimized, because there's no such thing as optimization. I think that's a like a moving target, that
Yeah.
new evidence is going to change things, and I'm like guilty of falling into those traps. I was just like talking to a friend of mine, and there was like an article that came out, in the health article that said like, drinking green tea has been shown to possibly reduce the potential for Alzheimer's later in life. And I'm like, buying all the green tea and just like drinking all the green tea. Like, it says possibly there's some evidence, but it's like, well, I think a lot of us are guilty of that kind of a thing, right? And I think there's a lot of grifters out there who take those things that aren't fully formed science and like really
Yep.
promote and sell that shit. And so I just try to be really clear around some of these things. Like we just don't know a lot of that. But if we look at the environment of evolutionary adaptation, we know that we assume and we have evidence for humans living in these immediate return societies. We don't see tools that would be equated with food storage, granaries and such. We don't see tools associated with food that requires long-term storage or would be stored for a long period of time. Um, and then there's a shift that happens, and we don't know when this shift happened exactly. It's the same with like the Neolithic revolution, right? There are these like flashpoints in human history that kind of like totally cascade and change everything. And I would assume that these sedentary, more delayed return hunter gatherers, as we call them, I would say they're probably like 50 to 60,000 years. I would say that the evidence goes back far enough in certain areas that it alludes to that humans were probably experimenting with these kinds of things. Not that it was like the thing, but because agriculture in a sense is like the most exemplary delayed return society. And delayed return just means you store food. So you get a delayed return on the investment that you made calorically for the calories that you're storing. So like in an immediate return society, you get an immediate return on your caloric expenditure. So you expend 1,000 calories in a day or so to go, obviously people do more than that. I'm just saying like a 1,000 for like in food acquisition on your walk or whatever, a 10,000 step walk to go get food. And you acquire different food, and the calories that you get from that are probably more than you actually need, definitely more than you expended. And then you just consume that food until you don't have any more, and then you go out and you get more. Whereas delayed return societies, they harvest a lot and then store it for days and days and weeks and months and years. Um, and what we see with that type of food storage is different than caching. Because, sometimes people will be like, well, but wait, other animals store food like in caches. Other animals don't guard their food storage per se. I mean, to some extent, but most of the food storage that other animals do when they cache it is hide it, like bury it or stuff it in a
Yeah.
tree somewhere or something like that. They're not like standing there guard. Most animals at least aren't standing there, guarding a specific food source that is their only one, right? And so when we see delayed return societies start to come up, we start to see an increase in human violence and things, proto war and war, because you have a surplus of food that is now stored in a particular place and everything wants to go get it. Like maybe you took all this food from other creatures and they're like, hey, what happened to all that food? Now, well, it's stored in this granary. How do we get in that granary? And then so there's just this conflict between these types of societies that are like that eat everything, without storing it, and those that want to store it and protect it at all costs because it was the energy that they expended. So it makes
Yeah.
sense economically for them to defend it. The challenge is then you have thieves, and once you have thieves, you have to create guards, and then you have a police. You have like essentially a group
Punishment.
of people that are punishment. You have a group of people that are controlling who has access to the food surplus, and then you have the origins of hierarchy. You have your first what would we billionaire class, and
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
warlords basically at that point in time, not not like tech warlords or whatever. Like these are literally people who have skill in combat and weaponry and things like this. And so, this goes on for 5,000 years, or more, like, post Neolithic. I'm like switching back to the previous thing about the Neolithic, the beginning of the Neolithic. But delayed return societies probably go back 50,000 years, and then you have sort of the exemplary delayed return society, which is agriculturalists who store loads of food for the year, particularly grains. And then about 5,000 years after the Neolithic, all these diseases have been wiping people off wiping off these agricultural societies until they build up a super immunity. And then with the Bronze Age, not only are they building, metal weapons more superior than the stone, but they're also super immune to these diseases. And so you see lots of different indigenous hunter gatherers and stuff like that just dying and we used to think that, oh, everybody must have just started farming because it was a better way of life. It was more like technologically advanced or adapted or something like that. But like through DNA testing now of skeletons, it's showing that that was not the case. Like you see hunter gatherer technologies in the archaeological record, and then right on top of it is the agriculture, and it happens like overnight in terms of time frame of history. And so people are like, oh, well, it's like the new iPhone comes out and everybody wants it or whatever, right? So agriculture must have been like that. It couldn't be further from the truth. Agriculture is a ridiculous amount of labor, and what you trade for so-called predictability with growing crops, which only happens in a stable climate, and we've just been in a stable climate for like 10,000 years, comparatively. Then you have this sort of predictability that some people would prefer that, right? And you also have like grains, which connect to like the opioid receptors in the brain. So there could also be some sort of like addiction to grains, playing a part of that, as well as just like the hierarchy that gets started that then forces people to stay in that way of life. Um, yeah,
It's really interesting in the book, Against the Grain. I feel like it touches on a lot of
totally.
that that time period, and yeah, that there was a lot of resistance from the more hunter gatherer folks
Oh yeah.
when these first kind of agricultural places were being set up, and then it just got amplified from then, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it is really interesting, like the mentality of what happens to the human mind when it's taken from that more place-based, Indigenous lifestyle, and yeah, put into civilization where you are told that you're an individual, you have individual needs, and everything's about the individual. And I feel like that's actually at the core of so much mental
Oh yeah.
illness of this day and
Yeah.
age. Like people are so lonely, people are so depressed and have anxiety and all these things. And I feel like that's really because we're actually living and thinking in a way that's not innately human, almost like, or I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe
Totally.
yeah, yeah. What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it when animals in captivity behave in a certain way, we call it caging behavior or zoochosis, which is basically like, psychological disorders that animals develop when they're put in an environment that is
Yeah,
not a match with their
yeah,
environment of evolutionary adaptation. And I think
yeah,
that's what we see in civilization. And, people don't often think of us as captives, but we really are. We're captives of a larger society.
yeah,
I don't necessarily, I think domestication is sort of the technology of captivity, but I like to sort of have the difference between wildness and captivity kind of take the front seat, because domestication is also something that people kind of use um, to describe different parts of domestication rather than like the process that I would call domestication. Um, yeah, I think you're spot on. Yeah, and I think it has to do with this mismatch that we live in today, where, like you said, we're projected. There's an individualist pursuit that is projected on us, and I think it happens because if we were to actually band together, we would probably resist those in power. So they want us to think and act like an individual rather than a collective,
yeah.
because collectives have more power, especially when it comes to things like revolution and transformation of systems of power that are in place. And so it behooves those in power to like force this individualistic idea onto everybody as a way of protecting their own self-interest and their own
Mm,
power.
yeah, and their own agenda, I guess, of
Hmm.
keeping the machine going.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, with all of that said, how can we, in this modern age, yeah, what are some steps that we can do to rewild to in a modern setting? Because you've got like the spectrum of like people like Link Spilden who are fully
Hmm.
just amazing, going right out, living off the land completely, and then your urban rewilder who lives in the city. And I think it's good to have a taste of it all because it's an amazing
Totally.
spectrum. But
Yes.
yeah, how can people of today rewild from day to day?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we deal with in Rewild Portland because the majority of our programs are in an urban context.
Yeah.
And the majority of our participants and community members and things are all live within the I don't know if we're a metropolis. I guess we, whatever, within the city limits, there's a lot of people here and there's a lot of laws and, a lot of space that's taken up and a lot of toxified environments and things. So rewilding is definitely a challenge, but I also think it's just sort of like what we have to do. I mean, if you think about, there's multiple layers to this, right? You have people like Lynx or Phoenicia, who's no longer with us, but was I think a rewilding elder in a similar type of vein, who live sort of on the fringes, doing this sort of like replica hunter gatherer thing. And that's just not accessible for the majority of people. Now, it is something that we could go do for a weekend or for a month or whatever. But really integrating that into the majority of people's lives is just something that's unheard of. And so for me, when I talk about rewilding, I really do like to focus on the urban context, because if we're actually looking at rewilding, it's really easy to run away to the wilderness. And I do that from time to time for my own mental health sake.
It's good to do it from time to time.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody should do that, especially for their mental health, and to just, because it's such an important part of being human, of being away from human made things. Like we forget
Absolutely.
that so much of the world just wasn't human, and
Yes.
we were a part of it rather
Yes.
than the dominators of it. And I think that that's one of the real reasons I think it's valuable for people to get the hell out of the city. And I try to do it on a regular basis. But that can be challenging too, gas money and, having a vehicle or transportation. Like there's definitely limits to that as well. That can be barriers for some people. But, if we're looking at domesticated environments or environments that are held in captivity, the city is like a prime example of that. And I think that means it's actually kind of the most necessitating of rewilding in that sense. That's a much deeper sort of rabbit hole to go down, of like, how do you rewild in the city? What are all the what is the like matrix of that? Because there's rewilding your own self, right? Which is like, what do you have the power over with your own body? And some of this to me comes back to the mismatch idea and the psychological idea. There's like things that we can do for ourselves just to make it easier to get out of bed in the morning, health wise. And so I'm not, sometimes people think I bash the like individualist rewilding stuff, and I don't. It's something that I like to put as a stepping stone to the other stuff, rather than the end all of rewilding, which a lot of people I see. The critique that I have of that is when people just stop at the individual level and they want to like sell some weekend retreat that's just like meditating in the forest or something, which again I think is beautiful and necessary. Right. But is that where you're stopping? There's a political structure that's destroying the world right now. And if we're not trying to dismantle that or challenge that, then we're just all gonna die. There's no fucking point.
Absolutely. I was listening actually to a podcast with Tyson Yunkaporta a few weeks ago, and he was saying, it's fine to go off and have these weekend retreats where you're doing your yoga with a tree or something and feeling inner peace. But he said, if you come back to your home and you're still feeling that inner peace, then you're not actually connected with the reality of the world, because you should feel upset, you should feel angry, and you should feel confused, because the state of the world is actually pretty fucked right now. And there is a danger with that kind of, I guess some of that spirituality kind of stuff, where it can be escapism and it can be really dangerous.
Yeah. And I think there's like predators that can easily fall into that like can kind of get people with their prescription or whatever of like, whether it's a health thing or a spiritual thing or whatever. I feel like there's definitely like, when I look at somebody who's doing rewilding stuff, I look through their bio, I look through like, what are they teaching? Where does it start and end in terms of like their politics? And I would say like the majority of people are doing exactly that, like at least online, in person, I think it's very different. And there are some fucking amazing schools out there and people doing really incredible things. And again, there's sort of like there's also like a stay in your lane sort of thing. Like some schools are just really good at that, at like selling these experiences of being outdoors. And I like celebrate those too. Again, it's like, but yeah, like you were saying, Tyson was talking about like, if you come back from that and you're like, I did my thing, I rewilded or whatever, like you're missing the point.
Yeah, it doesn't end.
Yeah, and is it possible for us to? Are we suggesting that people should go back to living as immediate return hunter gatherers? That's not possible. It's just not possible. And so it's not about that so much as it's about learning from those cultures of what was our environment of evolutionary adaptation, and what are we best adapted for, so that we can at
Yeah.
least have that as a baseline for what we want to try to do, even if it's not possible.
Yeah.
Just knowing that is super important for anything that we want to create. And I don't think that it's possible. I mean, it may be for some, there's still hunter gatherers that are living relatively immediate return, within different places around the world. But like, it's not like we can just go join them or something, or that would help them somehow, or that we could go and do that on our own. If people tried and were successful at that, I think it would be awesome. But again, like, not everybody in a city is going to be able to do that. There's not enough food and resources and all the things here. So what does it look like? And to me, it just looks like dialing back. Looks like permaculture, horticulture. It looks like encouraging more life. Paving over less. Like, concrete is one of the worst, most horrible inventions of civilization. Like, there's a graph that shows like how much material things humans have made since the Neolithic Revolution, particularly, but once it gets to like Roman era, when concrete was sort of like becoming a thing that we're using, like, concrete is like the most horrible thing aside from plastics that like has spread all over the world, and it's a heat sink. So, if you pave over all the land, we've got climate change, and we're like burning fossil fuels for our energy and putting that in the atmosphere. But then we also create these stone heat sinks. Like, there's just so many parts of civilization that are about heating the planet, even in these weird ways where these cities become microclimates of hot spots, because of the amount of concrete that's been poured, or cement. So yeah, I mean, tearing up the streets, planting back, that was Phoenicia's big thing. Her phrase was like, plant back, and that to me is like an essence of rewilding, is plant back food, because if civilization, as we start to decline into these other, whatever, I don't know, if climate change or fascism takes hold, or all these different things, like, what is this going to look like? And the best thing that we can do is plant back biodiverse ecosystems that are climate resilient, that produce food for people. And so, like our Rewilding conference, the annual North American Rewilding Conference that we host here in Portland, the theme of it has, for the last 5 years, been subsistence as resistance. Because if we want to create a different way of a life, that in and of itself is the biggest form of resistance you can, aside from like blowing shit up or attacking, in terms of
Yeah.
violent resistance. But the most
Yeah.
passive resistance that you can do is creating dual power through an economic structure of food production. If you don't have to get food from the grocery store, you're
Yeah.
essentially free from that economic structure, right?
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, and I think that's a really important one as well, like, because then that's bringing back the power into your own hands and the hands of the community, whether you're supporting like local farmers, or growing your own, or hunting, or making relationships with hunters. The food component of all the rewilding philosophies has been a crucial one for us over the last like almost decade, and really understanding how that where we get our food from. And of course, we still go to Woolies and that sometimes, like, but it's just about thinking about, okay, where can we get our food from that is going to actually be making it local, and not participating as much in the destruction and little things like that. It's like that, the lens of how you think about things, rather than just being ignorant about all of that. And you could say the same for clothes and everything. And I know some
totally.
people, that's probably not realistic for a lot of people to just have everything sustainable and all of that. But if you can just do your best, then that's really a massive step as well.
Totally. I mean, everybody starts somewhere, and
Yeah.
um, I buy most of my food from the grocery store. It's not like again, I live in the
Yeah.
city. I'm a
Yeah.
renter, which makes it more challenging, so there's lots of stuff that makes it a challenge, but we have this like charge to transform that,
Yes.
and it's going to happen eventually anyway, right? Like, I think some people, I used to think about rewilding as a way of sort of like preparing for the collapse of civilization. And I don't really
Mm,
think about it like that anymore because I really think that whatever happens is going to be totally random. And there's no way
yeah,
to really prepare for
prepare.
like every scenario. So, I mean, but it does lend you to be more adaptable, especially like you were, with like immediate return, like the understanding of that kind of a situation. Um, if you know wild foods, you're going to be more adaptable. If you
Yeah,
know how to garden, you're going to be more adaptable. You might not survive a pandemic, you might not survive a war or a famine, but you will be more adaptable to all of those things if you're doing rewilding stuff. So to me, it's not really like preparing for that as much as it's just like transforming my life to be more adaptable in that way. And as things change, then it opens doorways to be
yeah,
more along those lines. And I think about like in World War II, here in the United States, they did these things called victory gardens, where most of the like food production was going to the military and the armies and stuff. And so they like basically were like, everybody, you need to start growing food in your yard. And within like a year, 50% or more of like the produce that people were producing or consuming was coming from their yards
wow.
because there was a necessity for it. And I
Mm.
think, when the economy tanks or when things like that happen, I mean, think about like the pandemic, right? Like
Yeah, I was just
nobody
thinking
could
that.
go to work. I was gardening for 2 years
Yeah, yeah,
because I wasn't doing anything else. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's, people like, I don't have time to do that right now. It's like, yeah, because you have to fucking work a job. But like when the economy collapses, we're going to be
yeah.
gardeners, or, I mean, there's a lot of potential for regression in terms of rights and, who's doing what and the potential for some seriously messed up things like a return of agrarian slaveries or serfdom, or now we have like the whole tech feudalism thing that's happening these days. So it's not like it's all going to be for the best in that way, but like I think being into rewilding, when you know that what our evolutionary adaptation was, egalitarian people living in resilient lifeways, it's inspiring, even though in the moment we still have these hierarchies where people are encouraged to fuck each other over. So you kind of have to live in this balance too of not like, I'm not like all humans are peaceful if you can just change their mind. Like I actually do think there's sociopaths, that have like some form of brain damage or whatever. And the only way to stop them is to physically stop them from harming other people. Like those people exist. And oftentimes they're like CEOs or violent
Mm,
murderers or whatever,
yes. Yeah.
so being aware of those and also factoring that into your form of rewilding and training and all the different things, I think is equally important.
Yeah, absolutely. And essentially all of those things are just kind of remembering how to be a human as well.
Right,
That's a lot of the
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of what has made the most sense for us over the years. Like, yeah, we're learning different plants around. We're learning about the seasons, and we're getting more in touch with our local ecology. And it's like, why does this feel so good? Oh, because we're physiologically and biologically designed to be interacting with the land in that way. And it's so fascinating watching folks who come, yeah, to the gatherings that maybe live in a city, and their whole nervous system just gets over the 3 or 4 days just totally resets, and it's like, oh, there you are, there's the human being at like a balanced regulated
Yeah.
state because we're out
Yeah.
in nature doing what nature intended us to do, rather
Yeah.
than overstimulating our brain and hustling and always on the go. And it's like, oh, even I struggle with that. Like, even doing what we do, there's so much heady stuff that I have to be on top of with organizing the events and stuff. And I notice how dysregulated I get within that context. And so it's just such an amazing antidote to that, to build those relationships and make it a normal thing to kind of feel at home in the outdoors, whether that is just your backyard or your local reserve or doing it with other folks, like intentionally. It's, yeah, it's really just being human, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. I mean, and
Yeah,
that's to me, that's like the sort of hopeful, inspirational part of it, as opposed to like the fear-based side of rewilding of like doing it to survive the collapse or something instead of doing it for
Yeah.
that reason, reframing of like, I'm doing rewilding because it makes me feel alive, not because I'm doing it because I'm afraid that I need to survive the collapse, but because it makes me feel alive.
That's just a bonus that you have the
Yeah.
skills to be
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's really important for right now, I think, in the current status of the planet and the current status of the human mind as well. I think that, yeah, we're really, I think a lot of the mainstream kind of mind is confused on a right way forward, or feeling how to actually be okay amidst what's going on. And it just comes down to simplifying and, yeah, plugging back into, yeah, the natural world, and doing that with community as well. Yeah, I think all of those simple things go a very long way.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us about what you're doing. You're doing so many things over there in Portland, but tell us a little bit about Rewild Portland, and yeah, how folks might be able to reach you online and with your books or essays and all of those kind of things.
Cool. Yeah. So Rewild Portland is a nonprofit I started in 2010. And we do like low cost classes once a month in different ancestral skills and wild foods and things like that. And then we also do, and we just keep adding more things. I actually had like a burnout last October, and basically was like, I can't keep doing this. And so we're actually in the process of like reorganizing the
Yeah,
structure of how we generate revenue and stuff. Cause it was basically just me hustling for the last like 14 years.
yeah,
And most
yeah,
nonprofits actually have like a board of directors that does a lot of fundraising to pay for the executive director position. And we just have never historically done it that way. So we're changing things up. But we do a lot. We do a lot of free stuff. There's a thing called Spoon Club, which is a once a month green woodworking class where people can come and learn to work with their hands and carve and learn to use knives and things like that. And it's totally free. There's like arborists who show up with wood. There's like a bunch of people who all have that knowledge who do like a crash course. They trade off on like who's teaching what month. There's another program called the Philosopher's Fire, which kind of stemmed from um, Echoes in Time, our week-long ancestral skills gathering, as well as my rewilding classes. Because the rewilding classes are a lot more heady, like information. It's more dialogue. And
yeah,
there's people who are more into that than the crafting side of things. So
yeah,
we have the Philosopher's Fire once a month, which is like a thing that people can go to talk about different things through a rewilding lens. So each month is a question, and then people kind of talk about how they view that question through a rewilded lens. And then we have a death cafe, which is like, just for people to come and talk about death.
yeah.
Um, our society is like super death phobic. And so, and we don't see it. We don't talk about it. It's like this thing that is such an intrinsic part of life. We're all going to die. Everybody we know is going to die, and we just don't talk about it. And so, yeah, we do that once a month. And then we have
That's
we have a, say that again.
I just said that's really cool that you
Oh,
have
yeah,
regular thing to talk about that, because yeah, that's one of those things that kind of just gets brushed under the rug, and
totally.
no one really has any tools on knowing how to grieve properly and knowing how to
Yeah,
actually process death, whether that
yeah.
would be through processing an animal or processing the death of a loved one. Like that's so
Totally.
epic.
Yeah. And the Death Cafe, the name is like an international thing. So like it's a very specific formula that you follow and stuff like that when you do them. Um, and then we have a monthly hike, so people can, show up, go outside of city limits. Sometimes we're foraging for different things. Sometimes we work on crafts, even when we're out there. Like a couple years ago, there were a few of us on the hike, and I was like, "Who wants to build a bow drill from scratch out in the middle of nowhere?" And that was when I actually did a cordage with Scotch broom bark, which is an invasive species here from Europe. And it was just, I'd never done that before. I just tried it and it totally worked. So that was exciting.
That's so
Um,
epic.
yeah, we just do a lot of things. It's hard for me to keep track of all the things sometimes in my head because I don't run all of that. There's lots of
Yeah,
community members now that are kind of like organizing those, and we're trying to like decentralize it even more. So we're
yeah.
we're working on like a manual and stuff like that. So then I teach rewilding classes like the Rewilding 101 class, which now I call Rewild Your Mind. And then I have a Rewild Your Health, Rewild Your Child, and a Rewild Your Community, and I've basically diversified them into multiple classes because the Rewilding 101 just kept getting longer and turning into other things. So in the fall, I'll be offering like a whole new slew of rewilding classes. And also people would they kind of thought they had to take the Rewilding 101 class first. The way these are going to be set up is that you can kind of take any of them, and I'll have like a preamble at the beginning of them that kind of defines rewilding from the political sort of stance that I talked about
And
earlier.
is that online?
They'll be online. Yeah, they'll be on Zoom, probably at a time for Australia because it'll
Yeah,
be in the
cool.
evening here, which is like right now.
Yeah,
Um,
perfect. Middle
so
of the
it'll
day.
probably be accessible there, and then I might do it in a different time zone, so it would be accessible to people in Europe too, because I know I've had people there who've taken my 101 and would probably want to take some more of those too. And then I do those in person as well, so I kind of do both. And then we have Echoes in Time, which is our week-long ancestral skills gathering, which is kind of like the gathering that you guys do out there too. That one's been going on for like 26 years. Wasn't started by us. We bought it from the people who started it. Because I did work trade there for like 12 years. And then I asked the organizer, like, can I help you with the administrative stuff this year? And he was like, I'm ready to give it to you. I'm ready to pass it to you. And so,
That's
yeah, they passed it to us, which was super cool. And we've stewarded it for almost 10 years now. I think this will be the 10th year, which is
that's
exciting.
amazing. And that's just a
And
whole
then, yeah,
bunch of skills and things like that.
yeah, exactly. It's just people camp for 7 days and it's mostly handcrafts, but we also have an element called the social technologies camp where we talk about, different ways of doing conflict resolution or child raising or language acquisition or neurodiversity and rewilding. Like, what are the advantages and disadvantages to different, neurodivergent qualities, and, how can you work with what you have to maximize your potential or whatever. I don't know. Potential sounds gross, but,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
just how do
Yeah,
you
yeah,
work with it to benefit yourself, and enjoy your life in this way? Like, how can you organize it?
for
Because
sure.
sometimes people have challenges with things like ADHD or autism where it feels like it limits them. So we try to
Yeah.
like in that setting, try to figure out how we can actually make it less limiting in that factor and maybe put them into a path that's actually more suited for those qualities.
That's really
And then we
amazing,
have
and
the
I've been seeing some more research around anthropology and ADHD genes over the last few months, and
Mhm,
I'm really loving it
mhm.
because I got diagnosed with
Yeah,
ADHD when I was younger, and yeah, I'm reading it, and it's saying that that particular brain was created so that it could kind of oversee the bigger picture of everything, or like, and maybe go ahead and look and see what's over the ridge or something like that, like operate a little bit more faster paced and slow down to the details. And I love that anthropology now is helping, yeah, neurodivergent folks understand their place within the world, because society's like, you have to fit into this box, otherwise something's wrong.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just this diversity is more advantageous in evolution, in natural selection,
Yes.
in
Yeah.
competition, even in cooperation. Diversity is better than a lack of diversity. And
Yeah.
so, of course, people with these different, with neurodivergent qualities are going to be advantageous in a society that doesn't want everything to be structured and controlled to the
Yeah.
point of, where we just to produce products for a wealthy elite and they want it
Mm.
to run like a machine.
Yeah.
But a machine isn't adaptable. Machines
No.
are fragile and they break.
Rich.
They're
Yeah.
they're static. And so, that's why we're headed towards collapse, because we've built these solid systems that are going to shatter eventually. And what's
Yeah.
going to happen when they shatter? The people who embrace diversity are going to be the ones that adapt and survive best, because that's
Mhm.
how evolution works.
Mm.
Sorry,
For sure.
I just like, it's just insane right now. They're fucking deleting words like diversity from every fucking paper in the United States. Like, I don't know if you know what's going on here, but it is like a full on fascist coup right now. Like, the United States is fucking dead. Like, it is falling apart. Donald Trump is like totally destroying it. Sorry, I don't want to go. I don't want to get on a tangent, but like, they removed, like, the government required people to remove the word diversity, the word women, the word black, Like it's essentially Nazi book burning, but in a digital age. It's fucking
Oh my
insane.
goodness.
The
Whoa.
global order is going to be completely different in like 2 years, and who the
Well,
fuck knows what's happening. But like there is like an insane coup that happened here, and they're just dismantling the government and making and taking fascist strides. So I don't know where this is going to go. I was not, I did not expect this to happen so fast in terms of
no,
collapse with our social
no.
structure. But yeah, the United States is falling apart rapidly,
Do you think there'll be,
unintentionally. They're doing it intentionally.
and do you think there'll be a big resistance to that? Like, or is it going to be pretty full on for a lot of the people over there?
Hard to say.
Yeah.
I think right now it's still sort of late spring, winter. We'll see what happens when the things heat up in the summer. But like, I don't think people really realize how bad things are going to be until like 6 months from now. But they already abducted without cause or without evidence a Palestinian activist who had a green card, so he was like a permanent resident, and they had abducted him from his house in plain clothes with no like nothing, and he's being held in some detention facility now for like deportation, which is totally illegal in the United States. Like they just completely violated his rights, and nobody's doing anything about it because all of the government is basically run by them now. Like they just fired everybody. Like Donald Trump okay, I don't even want to get into this shit, but it's just crazy. It's just totally insane what's happening right now.
Wow. Wow. It feels like almost like it's the sign of some kind of ending of, if you want to get religious about it, it's like the sign of the end times, like how someone like Donald Trump is the prime minister, and then Elon
Fully,
Musk. It feels kind of surreal when
fully.
I try and grasp that. I can't
Yeah.
quite fathom it. Like it does feel
Yeah.
a bit like a
I
video
mean,
game or something.
totally. There's a playbook, Vladimir Putin did this in Russia and
Yeah.
Hitler did it in fucking Germany. Like there's a playbook
Yeah.
and they're just following it to a T and it's working. So who knows what the future holds here, but we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just rewilding is the future, regardless of what these people think it's going to be. Climate
Yeah.
change is going to completely make the global order impossible within another 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
like the extremities of the climate crisis are going to basically destroy people's ability to maintain this monopoly of violence. If
Mm.
we don't have oil production or farms because the climate is in its death throes, or it's just not the climate's not in death throes, the climate is just vacillating to a way where it's not predictable, then these large states don't have the ability to maintain this monopoly of violence that they have today. And I think they don't understand that. And that, like you can't talk about climate change now in the US government. Like they removed people, they told people they had to take out their pronouns from their emails, and they fired a federal employee who had their pronouns like in their email still because of that. Like that was a firing offense. So I mean, it's just stuff like that. They're just playing this game. They think that they are going to win, but
Wow.
ocean acidification is happening rapidly, and climate change is happening rapidly. And again, I don't like. There's this fear element that kind of comes up with a lot of this stuff, right? And this is where I think rewilding comes into play in terms of like, this is just me being a human in
Yeah.
this bizarre world that's like really trying to get us to not be human.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Um,
exactly right. And it feels like, yeah, because I'm someone that gets a bit, I don't deliberately pay or look into everything that's going on in the world, because even the things that do reach me is enough to make me feel overwhelmed and like, what the fuck
yeah,
is going on? But
yeah,
yeah, I think that in all of the things that are happening, it's just important to try and like talk about these things with community as well, so that you're not just processing it all together in your own mind. Like you can actually process these big
yeah,
conversations together.
totally.
And yeah, I feel like it lessens the intensity of it, because we're just doom scrolling on our phones and all these hectic things coming up.
Right.
And
Yeah.
of course, our
Yeah.
mind is not going to be able to process some of those intense emotions like on their own. I think it's so important to have these conversations with like your friends or with community to try and
Totally. Yeah.
actually unpack it and move it through your body, so you're not holding it
Yeah.
all. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think, too, like to me, there's they're starting to call this, I don't know who they are, but I've heard the term polycrisis come up a lot lately, where it's like people are starting to recognize there's all these different, overlaying crises. Really, they're all the same root of civilization, agrarian civilization from back 10,000 years ago, whatever, right? Like all stemming from that. It's like a snowball effect or something along those lines. But we have this polycrisis where you have all these different things simultaneously happening. And to me, rewilding is like the poly response, because everybody's going to do different parts of it. We're going to all respond in different
Yeah,
ways. And
yeah,
it's not a solution. It's not a
yes,
solution, but it's a response,
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's where the hope and value to me comes from, is that
yeah,
we are responding to this in a way that is about adaptation,
yeah, for
and we know
sure.
that because we've studied human history, and we know these skills make us more adaptable.
For sure. And as well, they're teaching you and giving you the tools to know how to regulate, because I think that's a huge thing amidst this
Totally.
global shit fight that we're in, is the
Yeah.
dysregulation of all of that. And then how can you live a normal-ish life if you're constantly feeling like dysregulated? And the rewilding lens, it just helps to regulate again. And I think,
Totally.
yes, all of the shit fights still happening, but if we can regulate within our little play space community and within our own bodies and with our own little ecosystem, then that's doing something good. Like, that's doing
Yeah.
something right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's big times, that's for sure.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, really big times. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Peter. It's been
You're
a
welcome.
great
Yeah, thank you.
rollercoaster deep dive into, yeah, and I'm sure that's just, yeah, I just admire how much your brain is just so full of all of this amazing knowledge of the past, and how you've just immersed
Mm,
yourself in that over the years, whether it's through the in-person stuff and the research you've done as well. It's really, really awesome, and it's really epic that you're educating people on a topic that is so, so important right now.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Do you have any last things you want to share, or any last words before we wrap this up?
No, just to thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing out there. I love the pictures of you, and the other crew that you've got doing, just all the different things you do. It's really nice to sort of live vicariously through different organizations doing similar things around the
For
world.
sure.
And of course, the
Yeah.
landscapes that you travel in are like epic and gorgeous. And
Yeah.
every time you post one of those, I'm like, I have to go there.
Yeah,
It
for
reminds me a
sure.
lot of Utah. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Utah, but Boulder Outdoor Survival School is situated in a place that looks very similar to a lot of the places that you post, with like slot canyons and things like that,
Yeah.
which are
Yes.
my favorite. Like slot canyons are my favorite. So,
Is that
um,
sandstone?
yeah, it's usually some form of sandstone, or yeah, just a slot canyon is where the water has, like, whittled it
Yes.
away. So you're just like in these like very, very huge deep canyons. And sometimes they have those like overhangs or like the
Yes.
arches and stuff like that. Yeah, it's just
It's
totally
going,
beautiful. I love that kind of scenery.
for sure. It's like kind of stepping into a very, very ancient world going
Exactly.
into those
Yes.
places.
Yes. Like you
Yeah,
expect a
well,
dinosaur to walk by.
for sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. Well, hopefully sometime in the not too distant future we can, yeah, have you over here and be traversing through the landscape.
I would love that.
Cool. Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome.